There's only so much you can do to make me look good. Seriously. Right, good afternoon, everyone, and we're going to continue our message through Matthew, the Olivet Discourse. It is Jesus' last discourse, and he's giving the disciples an absolutely fascinating lesson in history. And then what happens after that is he's exhorting them in the next chapter we get to next week for watching and waiting and walking in a godly way. And for those of you who are visiting today, I'll just give you an understanding. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus had an incredible confrontation with the Jewish leadership in the courts of the temple, and that was extremely volatile. And Jesus walked out having assigned them the question, how will you escape the sentence of hell? And that was a really edge of the moment for the disciples, because they had been with him for 3 to 3+ years, and they now associated with Jesus, and obviously they're expecting some payback from the leadership. So Jesus walked away from the temple, went down into the Kidron Valley, up and sat down on the Mount of Olives and looked back down on the Temple Mount and the city of Jerusalem in those days. And 4 of the disciples out of 12 came and asked him the questions, 2 sets of brothers, Peter and John and James and Andrew. And they were 3 of the first disciples that Jesus had got at the beginning of his ministry when he was baptized by John in the Jordan. And so they asked him 3 questions. And the questions were these, and I think we've got a screenshot for them there. They asked them, when will these things be? Because Jesus had said that this temple and this city is going to be destroyed. And that was unbelievable to the disciples, or to anyone else listening, actually, because the temple was a 10-storied high building. It had been started by, its renovation had been started by Herod the Great in 20 BC, and now we're looking at 30 AD. So it had been in construction and refurbishment for 50 years. And it was an incredible edifice. And Jesus has said, not one stone upon another will exist when this thing is destroyed. And that was just beyond the disciples' understanding. And the second question they asked him is, what will be the sign of your coming? He's already 3 times in these passages told them that he's going to be handed over to the leadership, and the Jews will hand him over to the Gentiles, and he'll be crucified, and on the 3rd day he will rise again. And so they didn't want to hear that. They really did not want to hear that. But having accepted that Jesus said that, they asked, what will be the sign of your coming back? And they were hoping it was in their lifetime. And what will be the sign of the end of this age? And here's the really Jewish thing that most people and many commentators just don't even understand, because you've got to be Jewish to understand Jesus' answer. So he answered the 3 questions this way. You got it, John? He answered the 3rd question first. Then he answered the first question second, and then he answered the second question last. And you cannot make a full assessment of what Jesus is saying to these 4 disciples unless you harmonize all 3 passages in the Gospels about this particular issue. There's Mark 13, Luke 21, and Matthew 24 and 25. And so now we've gotten to the stage where Jesus, 2 weeks ago, he gave us a potted history from the disciples' time and the persecution that they will receive 2,000 years ago, and he brought that right up to the First World War and the start of the 20th century, because everything that happened at the start of the 20th century was God putting into place what you and I are suffering from now. What has the last 2 years been like for your life? A kind of mayhem, a kind of trial, such as we would never have imagined could have come upon this country. As far, I don't worship country, all right? I worship my God. But this used to be a beautiful place to live. It was a spectacular place. I landed in the greater Victorian desert, started doing exploration mining, and all the way through, it's just been a brilliant place. And I cannot believe what 2 years has done to this place. And so he's giving these disciples a hint of what is to come. And we are now in the throes, in the birth pangs that Jesus mentioned in this discourse. And he said the first thing that will start off will be nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And that is a rabbinical term from 2 Chronicles saying that is a world war. Never before had there ever been a world war. And here we have World War I, and World War II, by the way, was part 2 of the same war. And the whole thing was set up because in the First World War, there was a massive death rate amongst the male soldiers that went to the First World War. My own wife, her grandmother had 4 brothers went to war in World War I from England, and none of them came back. 4 out of the 5 children died in that war. And that just ruptured society, and the consequences have been all the way through, because the same thing happened in World War II. The same thing happened in Vietnam. The same thing happened all over the world. There's this shattering of this normal family construct and the roles of men and women in this last 20th century. And so we went through the potted history in 24, 1 to 15, and then Jesus went from 1901 to halfway through the tribulation. And then last week we saw the abomination of desolation, which comes smack dab in the middle of the 7 years that we're waiting to come, and it's coming very quickly. And so he warned the Jewish people through these 4 guys, because it says, whoever reads, let him understand. So these scriptures will be read. When Jesus spoke these 2,000 years ago, they were taken down by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and believing Jews in this particular period of time will read them and learn to understand the signs that he is giving these disciples. And so we go now to almost the end of the tribulation in this particular message. And we start off here in Matthew 24, verse 29. And so the tribulation has come to an end, but on the very last day, something happens. And it's the most dramatic physical sign that the earth has ever seen. And in verse 29, it says, but immediately, straight away, so fast that no one can comprehend it, but immediately after the tribulation of those days. Which days? That's the 7 years of the tribulation. And it's 2,520 days since the little horn of Daniel signed a peace treaty with Israel. That's the specific number of days that exist in these 7 years. And after the tribulation of those days, Jesus says, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. And you'd take that for a given, really, because the moon only reflects the sun's light. Do you understand? If the sun's gone, it's dark. And the powers of the the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. That's the demonic powers in the demonic realm in the mid-heaven. And do you know what it's like? When I was putting this together, I sort of had this impression. Have you ever been to a live theatre performance? And you're sitting in the audience and everything is going on, and you're saying hello to each other and waving to each other, and all of a sudden, you know what happens? The lights come right down and they get turned totally off, and you're in this darkness in this room, and you've got the stage in front of you, and you've got the heavy curtains, and there's this sort of silence that falls upon the room, and all of a sudden the curtains open and you see the first act. This is exactly a magnificent form of that, because in this inky darkness, it's global. It is global, and you cannot see a thing. And let me tell you this. I used to work in a mine and I was 1,000 feet below the surface, all right? And like any newbie, when you first go down to 1,000 feet below the surface and you've got your hat on and your cap lamp, one of the things you like to do is go into a drive where there's no lights and you actually turn your cap lamp off to see how dark is. Well, I'll tell you what, 1,000 feet under the earth, it's dark. And I just did this to myself. I brought my hand up to my nose and until I could feel the hairs on the back of my hand. I still couldn't see my hand. The darkness was unbelievable. And this is what has happened now at the end of the days of the tribulation, this inky black nothingness, and everyone is stunned. Everyone is going, what is going on? And there's two little passages from Joel that emphasize this. And everyone has just gone through 7 years of absolute mayhem. And Joel says this, he tells and predicts what's going to happen there, but there's something that comes after that you and I need to take really good notice of. And Joel 2:10-13, verse 10, is before them the earth quakes, the heavens tremble, the sun and the moon become dark, and the stars lose their brightness. Verse 11, but this, the Lord utters his voice before his army. His camp is indeed very great. For mighty is one who carries out his word, and the day of the Lord, this tribulation, is indeed great and very awesome, and who can endure it? And verse 12, this is what God says to all of us. When we go through trials, when we go through our own little tribulation, and we've suffered and we've endured, there is something that always comes from God to say, no, there is a light coming. There is a light coming. There is a solution to your tribulation coming. That's the personal application to you and me. And in verse 12, the Lord says this, yet even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all of your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning, and tear your heart, that is, rend your heart, and not merely your garments. Now return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in mercy, and relenting of catastrophe. You know, so many people have got this impression of God, and God the Father especially. And my wife was, when we were brand new Christians decades ago, she had sort of, I better be careful, she had a strong-willed father, all right? And so many of us get our impression of God from the impression that we got from our own fathers. Do you understand? And some fathers have been good and some fathers have been not so good. And there was like a strictness in my father-in-law. I mean, it didn't help that he was very taciturn and 6'3" tall. You know, he gave you the impression. On the other hand, I had Fred as my father, and he was shorter than me, and he spoilt me rotten. So, you know, I have got no problems with fathers. I mean, and I can see a lot of God in the way that Dad always treated me and treated the rest of the kids. You know, for my entire life, and I don't know how I escaped it, he never laid a hand on me. Not once. But I tell you what, if you got his look, you trembled. That's all you needed. And sometimes God gives us that look, all right? And that's all you need. And in chapter 3 of Joel, 13-16, it's the same thing. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come tread the grapes, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. This is when the whole of the remainder of the people on the earth at the end of the tribulation will face two judgments, and we do that next week. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. The sun and the moon have become dark, and the stars have lost their brightness. And the Lord roars from Zion, and once again you get his grace and his mercy after this warning. He utters his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth quake. But the Lord is a refuge for his people. He's a refuge for every one of you here. Do you understand that? This is not just an academic presentation where I'm speaking to you and you're listening. This is truth. in reality. And so the Lord is a refuge for his people and a stronghold for the sons of Israel. So we've looked at what happens at the very end of the tribulation. It's inky blackness. No one can see anything. And verse 30 says this, and I've got to emphasize this, that all three messages that I've given in this presentation, every verse is indicative of a sequence of events. It's not just one whole big cake mix. There is a structure and a sequence to everything that happens in these warnings from Jesus. So firstly, he says, at the end of the days, there'll be inky blackness global. No one will be able to see anything. And in verse 30 he says, and then. So this is the next thing that happens after the blackness. Shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. So right now, in the inky blackness of the global environment, the sign of the Son of Man, sun suddenly appears in the sky. And there's so many arguments as to the sun, what the sign of the Son of Man is. And it's quite, if you understand Jewish and Rabbinic Judaism, you know what it is. Because I've got two examples here. The word, or the letter in the Hebrew is tav. And that's the last letter in the Hebrew alphabet. You've got aleph and you've got bet, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. And that is wrapped up in so much understanding in the scriptures of the sign of the Son of Man. And because of our big presentation, I'm really pushing through this. The top one is the modern tav. And the bottom one is the paleo tav, the last letter in the Hebrew alphabet. What does it look like? That's the Paleo Tav, and Paleo Hebrew never ever disappeared until after the Jews were finally kicked out of Israel in 135 by Emperor Hadrian, because he was sick and tired of all of these revolts against Roman rule. So they emptied the country of the Jewish people, and then Paleo disappeared. But this is the sign of the Son of Man, and I'll tell you why. Go down a bit more, John. Give me the Hebrew verse, please. This is Hebrew, right? Bereshit, in the beginning. Created God. In Hebrew, the verb always comes before the subject, all right, the noun. So Bereshit, created, that's in the beginning, created bara God, the heavens and the earth. And don't forget, you've got to read it backwards. But there's something very, very interesting in the middle. There's an aleph there in the middle. Do you understand? Because the aleph, the beginning, is there at the start of creation. Do you understand? And that is the part of God's name in the Hebrew. So there is the aleph, and it's God. So Jesus there is the creator God who brought forth the heavens and the earth. And you know, even the earliest patristic fathers after John died in 100 AD, they picked up this synonym for the sign of the Son of Man, because even when they went to Greek, there is a Greek picture that actually explains that quite powerfully. See this? This is the Alpha and the Omega. And the patristic fathers even understood what the aleph and the tav was. The aleph was in that verse at the very beginning of creation. And here we've got, at the end of this age, the cross coming, the tav, because it is the completion. It's the beginning and the end, the first and the last. And Jesus, who was alive, was dead, and now is again. And so Jesus now has shown this. This is Alpha and Omega, and even the patristic fathers knew that the cross was in there. Carry on, John, please. That's the sign of the Son of Man coming in heaven. And look at verse 30a. Verse 30a says this, and then, again sequence, inky blackness. All of a sudden, everyone has to look up and they see the sign of the Son of Man coming in the heavens. What is it? The cross. It is the cross. Some people have said it's Jesus himself. It can't be, because in the structure of these verses, Jesus himself is laying down a sequence. One thing happens, then another thing happens, then another thing happens. And then, because they see the cross in the skies coming towards them with the inky black background, all the tribes of the earth shall what? One of my favourite commentators tried to suggest that it was the Shekinah glory. It can't be, because Jesus comes with the clouds of heaven. So this is the sequence. And if it was the Shekinah glory, wouldn't you think that some of them would be happy that he was coming back? But look at what they are doing. They're mourning because this cross is coming. And Zechariah 12 verse 10 just pours this out beautifully. And verse 10 says this, "And I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace," and here it says pleading, but it's really supplication, but supplication is pleading anyway, "so that they will look at me whom they pierced." Semicolon. You've got to stop there. That's a complete statement as in part of the verse. They will look upon me whom they pierced. What was he on when he was pierced? The cross. "And they will mourn for him, like one mourning for an only son, and they will weep bitterly over him, like the bitter weeping over a firstborn." And verse 30b says this, "And they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven." That's the Shekinah glory. He comes down to the mid-heaven for the church, and that comes in a later passage here, in the Shekinah glory with the clouds of heaven. And there was one guy who emails me after every YouTube presentation, and he says, Pastor, he says, "This person told me that there's no such thing as the Shekinah in the Bible." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, but it is well known that it's the clouds of heaven. It's the glory that surrounds God whenever he appears in his deity. And they shall see," in verse 30b, "the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." And verse 31, "And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet blast, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds." And that's a euphemism for everywhere on the earth. His elect, those chosen ones who have survived the tribulation. And next chapter that we get into, which will last 2 or 3 weeks, is two judgments. There's a judgment of the Gentiles that survived the tribulation. That's called the sheep and goat judgment. It's nothing to do with the nations. That is one of the worst continuous misapplication of the word ethnos. It is the sheep and goat judgment of the peoples. Everyone who is not a Jew. And, one of my favourite messianic Jewish commentators makes a big deal about Jesus judging the Gentiles at the end of the tribulation in Matthew 25, the sheep and goat judgment. But he somehow seems to miss the judgment of the Jews. And that's in Ezekiel 20, 33 to 44, and we'll do that when we go through 25. And so both entities, the Gentiles and the Jews, must face a judgment before the millennial kingdom can be inaugurated. And so he gathers his elect, so that's his believers from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. And in verse 32, he says something very interesting, and I've split it into two parts because someone said to me last week, next week are you going to do the fig tree? And I said, yes, I am going to do the fig tree next week. But there is a problem with people thinking that the fig tree is Israel. It's not Israel. It's a metaphor for judgment, because he cursed the fig tree when he went into Jerusalem after they had rejected him. Do you understand? So it's always a prefigurement that the fig tree then was cursed. And he says, look at the parable of the fig tree. And I've got a picture of a fig tree. A mate of mine up in Bindoon's got a fig tree. And that's a fig tree. And in Matthew, all he says is, now learn the parable of the fig tree. That's all he says. But in Luke 21:29, Luke records the same thing, but look at what he says. And he told them a parable. Look at the fig tree and what? All of the trees. All of the trees. We're looking at arboreal truth here. Do you know what arboreal truth is? Arboreal is pertaining to trees. These are deciduous trees that drop their leaves in autumn. They're bare through winter, and when spring comes, they sprout again. They leave again. Do you understand? And so instead of making a mistake that the fig tree in this particular instance is Israel, it's not. Jesus is warning them to be watching and waiting, because when he says this, as soon as its branch has become tender in the spring and sprouts its leaves, you know that summer is near. And verse 33, he says, and so you too, when you see all these things, comma in verse 33, what things? And the things that they have seen has been the abomination of desolation, fleeing to Bozrah, being protected first by Jesus, then the angels, but also the mark of the beast, the false prophet, the worldwide genocide, primarily of the Jews, but also of anyone who refuses to take the mark. They've seen all of that since the abomination of desolation. And so these are the things that they have seen. Recognize that he, Jesus, which is in the modern version, he, Jesus, and I've got an insert in my notes in the King James, it's it. So there's Jesus and the it is near, right at the door. And what does those two translations mean? It means when Jesus is mentioned, the king is coming. And when it is coming, it's the kingdom. And you can't have a kingdom without a king, and you can't have a king without a kingdom. So it's one of these, these little frustrations that you get in translation, but both are right. And he says that when you see all of these things, recognize that he, Jesus, is near, right at the door. And this is the second advent. And verse 34, he says this, truly I say to you, and this is the most misunderstood, most twisted verse in this whole passage. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, verse 35, but my words will not pass away. And everyone comes up with these weird interpretations of this generation. You have to be sort of around about my age, or not much younger. Can you remember a certain person called Harold Camping? Harold Camping looked at this particular verse, and he established that a generation would be nearly 40 years. So he saw the establishment of the nation of Israel, and he added a year, and he wrote a book called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Happen in 1998. 1988, yeah. Because he thought a generation was 40 years. And so everyone got all excited about, looking forward to 1988. And 1988 passed and went, and all these books were put on the bookshelf. But he had the gall to say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. And so he wrote another book, added another 10 years, and I think it was 98 Reasons that Jesus is coming in 1998. Give me a break. And do you know what? The same people went out and bought the same books. You can't believe these things. There's even so-called prophets on the YouTube now. And the moment these people say something, people rush out and buy the DVD or rush out and buy the book. And then when it passes by and it never came to fruition, they say, perhaps his next one will be accurate. And they go out and buy the next one and the next one. It's just beyond my belief. Listen to me. I'll give you a tip for free. Trust Jesus. He's the best prophet we've got in the Bible. And so what he's saying there, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So he's finished now. One of the questions was, what is the sign of the end of this age? Jewish people then and now only ever recognize two ages, two theological ages. The current age, which was from creation until the Messiah comes, and the second age is the millennial age, which carries on forever and ever. They only believe in two ages. We have three. We have the millennial kingdom, and there is the third dispensation, which is the new heavens and the new earth in Revelation 21 and 22. And so what Jesus is saying, this is now the end of this age. And truly, everyone who's alive to see these things, the abomination, the mark of the beast, all of those things that are in Revelation 13 and onwards, that generation will not pass away until everything takes place and Jesus comes back. Now, this is a curly one. I'm going to love spinning this one at you. Verse 36 starts with but. It starts with but. And but is a English translation. There's several translations of a tiny little Greek word called day, which is D-E. And it's a participle that joins one previous statement to the next statement. And it's either continuing the theme or it's completely opposite, introducing an opposite theme. And this is even more important here, because this is one device that Paul uses in the first letter to the Corinthians. He had so much to discuss with the Corinthian church by letter. He had sexual immorality in chapter 5, and then Christians taking each other to court in front of pagan judges, and then divorce and all the rest of it. And so he kept saying, and now concerning, and now concerning, and now concerning. He kept changing the subject that he was dealing with. And here it's in the emphatic, it's peri-day. It means but. And Jesus is using the same thing, peri-day, but. And I struggled with this whole thing for years and years and years and years when I first read it and was trying to work it out in the context of the end of this age. And until I got into the Greek and I learnt the Greek and I understood the sentence construction, but now is introducing a parenthetical insert which is related to but separate from the current subject, which is the end of the age. Because Jesus now says, but about that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. What on earth has he introduced the subject to now? And I listened to all of my old, trusted commentators who wormed their way around this trying to fit it into the end of the age. It can't fit into the end of the age because the day and the hour that Jesus is talking about, no one knows when it's going to be. Not even the angels of heaven, nor even the Son, but the Father alone. And it can't be the second advent because that can be precisely determined by counting 2,520 days from the signing of a peace treaty between Israel and the little horn that eventually becomes the Antichrist by committing the abomination of desolation, from which you can also count the second advent, which is half of those days, 1,260. It cannot be the second advent because you can put it on your calendar. If you're unlucky enough to be here during this time, you can mark your calendar 2,520 days, 7 years, 30-day months after the signing of a peace treaty with Israel. And you can know that that's when the Messiah is coming back again. So Jesus is talking about a day and an hour that no one knows. Not even the angels of heaven, not the Son, but the Father alone. And here it is in verse 37. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. And the coming there is parousia. It is not coming to the earth, it's coming into the heaven, into the clouds. That's a parousia. He doesn't, in a parousia, it's an appearance. He doesn't come to the earth in a parousia. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. And quite frankly, with what's going on in the world today, I have got such an understanding now of the days of Noah. The rampant chaos, the complete and utter immorality, the violence and everything that's happening. I've actually stopped watching so many of the news feeds. I mean, my wife has she works in a Jewish home, and the Jewish ladies of her age, they love her. There's something about her that the Jews love. And they have for 27 years up there. And anyway, they always want to go on about COVID and the events that have transpired from that. And I'll tell you right now, this church is pro-choice. Whatever you do, that's your right. I don't care whether you do or you don't. The only entrance to this door, through this door, is you want to know Jesus, is you want to get Jesus into your life. That's it. That's the only choice you have to make. And for this coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. Well, we're there now. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. What are we doing these days? Drinking and eating. And for a certain group, they're getting married soon, fairly recently. And so everything was carrying on in a perverse environment, in a daily routine, if you like. And in verse 39, Jesus says this, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the parousia of the Son of Man be. And in verse 40, be careful with this, because I'm going to add a passage from Luke. At that time, Jesus says, at that time, 2 men will be in the field. Semicolon, statement, standalone statement. And by the way, the men there is in, see, that's bad. In your translation, you'll have men in italics. The men is not in the original Greek. It says 2 in the field, but I'll expand on that in the Luke passage. 2 men will be in the field, 1 will be taken, and 1 will be left. And all of a sudden, people are going to say, well, and I know that's one of your favourite YouTubers, and I listened to it intensively, and I chewed it over for years. He did this about 2 or 3 years ago. And he says, well, the ones that were taken were the ones that died in the flood. Well, that doesn't fit either the Hebrew and the Greek, and I'll tell you why. Because the word taken here in Greek is aros, and it means to be lifted up. And then all of a sudden, all the gears in your brain are starting to click, 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 click. What is he talking about? So 1 will be taken and 1 will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. Semicolon, standalone statement. 1 will be taken and 1 will be left. 1 will be lifted up and 1 will be left. But Luke 17:34 to 36, and poor old John had to do this. For those of you who are new, I've got a software package where I've got 54 different English translations of the Bible. And I had to go all the way down to get this correct translation of what is in the Greek. And poor old John had to put it together like this. So it's Luke 17:34 to 36 in the Lexham. And this is Luke repeating this particular passage that Matthew puts in Matthew 24, but this is the same discourse that Luke is recording in chapter 17. And he says, Jesus says this, I tell you, in that night there will be 2 in one bed. Not men. When I first read that passage more than 3 decades ago, now, sensitive to the legislation they're about to bring into the West Australian Parliament, I went, ugh, but, it wasn't, a bit weird in a Bible. But it's not in the Greek. That's what's in the Greek. 2 will be in the bed. 1 will be taken, Iris, and the other will be left. Verse 35, there will be 2 women grinding at the same place. 1 will be taken, the other will be left. And verse 36, which Matthew doesn't record, there will be 2 in the sequence, there will be 2 in the field, 1 will be taken and the other will be left. Do you understand what Jesus is trying to emphasize here? He's already explained this, but you have to look carefully at the Luke passage to understand it. He's saying, back in verse 36, no one knows the day or the hour that this event is going to take place. And so in the Luke passage has 3 examples. 2 will be in one bed. What time of the day is that? 2 women will be grinding at the same place. Dawn, because it's the woman's job in ancient cultures to grind the flour, mix it with the oil, put the dough on the hot rocks, and that's when you have your morning bread. That is the normal thing that happens, and it takes place at dawn, and also the fetching of the water. 1 will be taken and the other will be left. There will be 2 in the field. 1 will be taken and 1 will be left. What are you doing out in the field? Sowing, reaping, harvesting, whatever you like, shepherding the flock. That's daytime. So look at the 3 examples. Midnight, morning, midday. Jesus says you don't know and you will never know when it's going to happen. It could happen at midnight when you're snoring your head off. My wife has said to me, I wish it wasn't a crime to put a pillow over your head sometimes. I said, I don't hear a thing, but anyway. There's 3 parts of the day that Jesus gives you in this passage to understand you can't even predict the hour that it'll happen. But the second advent, not the parousia, the second advent, you can time it to the day and you'll know when exactly it happens because there will be inky blackness suddenly. And then you look up and you see the sign of the Tav coming towards you, and then you mourn. Why do you mourn? Because he was crucified on a cross 2,000 years ago. And what so many people don't understand, especially unsaved people, is that when Jesus died on the cross, he didn't die for Christians. He died for everyone. And there is a doctrine within Christianity called propitiation. And propitiation is the turning aside of God's wrath when you sin. In the Old Testament, he was looking forward to the cross. In the New Testament, God looks back to the cross. The cross is the centroid of humanity. And so what he is saying here, in 1 John 2:2, you have this particular verse. John is speaking to the believers in the church at Ephesus, and he says this, Jesus died for our sins. And everyone in the Ephesian church is going, yeah, that's right. And then John adds this, and not for our sins only, but for the sins of the whole world. The whole world. Do you know that every rotten human being that's ever lived, including all of us, we're only saved by grace. There's not an ounce of merit in us that rewards us with salvation. He died, and every sin was placed on him, on that cross. That's why Isaiah says his form was so marred that he didn't even look like a human being. And that was the cost to Jesus Christ and the Father looking down upon that for the sins of the whole world. And Jesus says something here in a minute. And by the way, just as a little aside, in the middle example, there is two women grinding at the same place. It's always the women making the flatbreads at breakfast time, but it's included there, and it's correct because the two of the women, the two is in the feminine gender. So it makes sense. Do you understand? And if you didn't even get the women thing, if you knew the Greek as they did when they were reading it, they would understand that that was two women. And it's absolutely brilliant. So in verse 42, Jesus says, because I've just told you this, be on the alert, therefore, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. And Fruchtenbaum says, I'm taking a exegetical, pure look at the Greek in this passage. And you look at all of those verses then. This is a day and an hour when no one knows it's going to happen. It's the doctrine of imminency. It could happen before I can even finish this sentence. Do you understand? And we're gone. We're out of here in the twinkling of an eye. And this is what Jesus is saying. So he's just told the 4 disciples, all of these things are going to happen right up to the end of the age. And within that time frame, something is going to happen that you can't guess at, you can't predict, you can't estimate. There is an event that will take place, and you don't know the day or the hour. Therefore, he says, be on alert. And verse 43, he says, but be sure of this. And this is just a plain reading. You don't need to dig into this that some people have. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would have not allowed his house to be broken into. That's a simple thing. If you are alert and you're secure in your home, you've got the windows locked, the doors locked, and all the rest of it, and you're awake and or at least able to be awoken by noises, the thief cannot come into his house. And verse 44, Jesus says this, for this reason, you must be ready as well. Do you see what he's teaching from this passage onwards? Watching and waiting and being ready. So if you're watching and waiting and being ready for an event that you don't know when it's going to happen, you should try and make every day a better day than yesterday. That's what Jesus is saying. He's not asking for perfection. He's just asking for you to be aware that your Saviour on the cross is coming back soon for you. And you know what? Verse 45. When then is the faithful and sensible servant? It says in this translation slave, but slaves were servants in this time plane. Sensible service whom his master put in charge of his household, servants, to give them their food at the proper time. Blessed is that servant whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Verse 47. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. And we haven't got time to go to Romans 8 and all the other passages where it promises the body of Christ, co-heirship with Jesus Christ and an heirship from God. And we get all things. And I can't believe that. When I look at the heroes of the Old Testament and I look at the suffering of the tribulational saints, I don't know how we got to be so privileged to be within this dispensation. It is absolutely gobsmacking. And 48 here, but if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time, and he begins to beat his fellow servants, and he eats and drinks with those who are habitually drunk, that's the description. This is the consequence. Verse 50, then the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect and at an hour that he does not know. And so this is the repetition of imminency. And he will cut him in two and assign him with a place with the hypocrites. And in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And that's the thing that I explained last week. I've been in a couple of situations where I've done something completely and utterly ridiculous, like bump into the back of someone in a car, very softly, mind you, didn't break anything. But I'm very hard on myself for making mistakes, and that's one of my character flaws. Because I got out, and the poor lady in front of me got out of the car and said, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, because she took off and then stopped, right? So I took off when I saw her taking off, and I checked what the siren was way over there. And she stopped again, and so I just went nudge. And I got out of the car, and she went, sorry, I'm so sorry. I said, listen, it wasn't your fault. It's my fault, legally and rationally. And I was so angry with myself, and I said this last time, I found myself gnashing my teeth, saying, you idiot, you idiot. And that's a funny part of it, but look at what Jesus is saying. That the people who reject Jesus will be in a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. And the reality is, through propitiation, Jesus died for the sins of every single living human being. Even Schwab, even Gates, even Fauci, even Soros, and all the rest of them, he died for their sins. Propitiation renders every human being savable. But you've got to make a decision. You have to make a decision. And I thought very hard about this verse when, we had our little bingo about 6 weeks ago. And I thought to myself, I can understand weeping because you're where you don't want to be. But the gnashing of teeth is a totally different take on it. Because those people will then realize that Jesus had already died for their sins. And you can distill Christianity down to 2 simple statements. There is only one way to get to heaven. Only one way. And that's accepting what Jesus Christ did for you on that cross 2,000 years ago. And there is only one way of going to the other place, and that's by rejecting what Jesus did for you on that cross. Do you understand? And I've got 2 brothers that just stubbornly won't listen. But that's the truth. That is the absolute truth. And this passage here by Jesus, in the whole passage of Matthew 24, it is an incredible statement by Jesus to 4 guys who wanted to know the truth. And he went from their time right up to the end of this age and gave an answer in sequence for everything that's going to happen. But he finished off this one to be ready and watching and waiting for an event that no man knows the day or the hour of. And you should all know what that is. It's called the hupazo, the lifting up of the church. And so, Father, we come before you this afternoon. And Father, I'm in awe of the way that you have the Holy Spirit writing this word, Father. It is such an illuminating experience, Father, for me to just put it together. And it's an even more and greater privilege to be able to read it. And in a Bible, it's available to everyone, Father. So there is no excuse for us not knowing the truth. And so, Father, we come before you this afternoon in true humility, but also incredible gratitude that you loved us so much that you allowed your only Son to come to the earth, take on the like of human flesh, and to die on that cross 2,000 years ago. And on the 3rd day, Father, you raised him up to life, and he lives evermore now at your right hand, Father, making intercession for every one of us. So, Father, I cannot thank you enough. And by the way, Father, I can't wait till I can see you. And all God's people said, Amen.